In the words of Winston Churchill, in the Second World War, every bond between man and man was to perish. Crimes were committed by the Germans under the Hitlerite domination to which they allowed themselves to be subjected, which find no equal in scale and wickedness with any that have darkened the human record. The wholesale massacre by systematized processes of 6 or 7 millions of men, women and children in the German execution camps exceeds in horror the rough and ready butcheries of Genghis Khan, and in scale reduces them to pygmy proportions. Deliberate extermination of whole populations was contemplated and pursued by both Germany and Russia in the Eastern War. The hideous process of bombarding open cities from the air, once started by the Germans, was repaid 20-fold by the ever-mounting power of the Allies, and found its culmination in the use of the atomic bombs which obliterated Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It was a simple and noble policy to keep Germany disarmed after the struggle of the First World War, and the victors sufficiently armed in vigilance. But errors were soon made. America's failure to enter the League of Nations, the weakness and lack of resolution of Western democracies to confront the growing strength of the fascist dictators in Germany, Italy and Japan, and the economic turmoil that allowed these events to spark and build. Upon reflection, it is all too easy to see and understand how this tragedy could have been avoided. But for those in power at the time, they failed all too well to see the gathering storm that confronted them. The origins of the Second World War can be found within the confines of the Palace of Versailles. Germany's surrender in the First World War was a shock to both the international community as well as to its people. Militarily, Germany had been successful on the Eastern Front. Troops were deep within France, and Germany itself was untouched. However, on November 11, 1918, at 11 a.m., the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, a ceasefire came into effect. An armistice had been signed, and the war to end all wars had come to an end. The proud peoples of Germany had been defeated. The Allies, victorious after 4 years of suffering and untold casualties, wanted to see Germany pay. To ensure something like this would never happen again, an international institution was to be established, in the hope of bringing about a new world of collective security, later seen in the form of the League of Nations. In early 1919, the Germans were summoned to Versailles, not to negotiate, but rather to hear the terms they would have to implement and endure. David Lloyd George of Great Britain, Woodrow Wilson of America, George Clemenceau of France, and Orlando of Italy all attended with the aim of weakening Germany. World War I had radically altered the political European map, with the defeat of the Central Powers including Austria-Hungary, Germany, Bulgaria and the Ottoman Empire. The German state that came out of the Great War was also to experience profound change and suffer severe territorial losses. Germany was to lose a portion of its eastern land, creating a new Polish state and establishing a Polish corridor between Germany and East Prussia, giving Poland access to the sea. The port city of Danzig, the largest city on the coast, was given to the League of Nations. Mabel in the Baltic was handed over to Lithuania, Alsace-Lorraine to France, and the mineral-rich Saarland was to be administered by the League of Nations for a span of 15 years, with the Rhineland becoming a demilitarized zone, providing France with additional security. The German colonies in Africa were distributed to the British and the French, and their South Pacific colonies would be given to Japan. In addition, military clauses were added to the treaty. The German army could be no larger than 100,000 troops, they were allowed no air force, no tanks or heavy artillery, and the German navy could have no more than 6 warships, with no U-boats or submarines. Insult being added to injury, a war guilt clause was placed in the treaty, making Germany accept full responsibility for the outbreak of the war, as it was only on this basis that the Allies could demand reparations. France and Britain had begun the war as creditor states, but had ended as debtor nations and wanted to be repaid. The sums being asked of Germany in reparations were many times more than was possible for them to pay, placing a severe burden on their economy, which later contributed greatly to economic instability and hyperinflation. John Maynard Keynes, the primary representative of the British Treasury at the time, said, "I believe that the campaign for securing out of Germany the general costs of the war was one of the most serious acts of political unwisdom for which our statesmen have ever been responsible. The German people believed they had been bitterly betrayed by their high command and unjustly treated by the international system, views that would later materialise throughout the 1920s and 30s. After the Wall Street crash of 1929 and the preceding Great Depression, the world was plunged into economic turmoil and Germany was hit hard. American banks withdrew the loans they had made to Germany and the economy collapsed overnight. Due to such large reductions in cash and capital, banks struggled to provide money and credit, and so in 1931 there were runs on German and Austrian banks, with several of them closing. Businesses closed at an alarming rate, and by 1933 unemployment had reached 6 million. Many people were left homeless and thousands of children died from malnutrition. A lack of government resolve, and out of despair, many turned to alternative political leaders and parties in the hope their problems would be solved. One man in particular garnered a lot of attention from his rousing speeches, and this man was Adolf Hitler. Hitler's speeches delivered clear culprits for Germany's problems. The November criminals who had signed the armistice ending World War I, the liberals and socialists who had signed the Treaty of Versailles, the communists who threatened revolution in Germany, and finally the Jewish bankers who plotted to undermine and destroy the German state. The Nazi and Communist parties both clashed violently, and Hitler claimed to be the only one to bring about order and end the Red Plague. As a powerful and gifted public speaker, Hitler was able to capitalise on public discontent. His party, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or the Nazi Party, grew to record levels. In September of 1930, the Nazi Party had increased its representation in the Reichstag, the German parliament, almost tenfold, winning 107 seats, and only 2 years later in 1932, they won 230 seats, becoming the majority in parliament. Hitler had found the failures and misery of the Great Depression to his advantage, stating for hard reality has opened the eyes of millions of Germans. In the 1932 election, Hitler also ran for president, and although he lost to decorated war hero Paul von Hindenburg, his rising popularity gave President Hindenburg no choice but to appoint Hitler on the 30th of January 1933 as Chancellor of Germany, head of the German government. Just 1 month after Hitler had been sworn in as Chancellor, a fire was started in the Reichstag by a young Dutch communist who was then used to paint all communists as the enemy of Germany. Using Article 48 of the Constitution, the Reichstag Fire Decree was passed that abolished civil liberties such as freedom of speech and freedom of the press. Shortly after, Hitler created a secret police known as the Gestapo, helping him to suppress any and all opposition. As Chancellor, he also tripled the size of the German military, violating the Treaty of Versailles, banned all rival parties, killed political opponents, and prohibited Jews from working, voting, and occupying public spaces. After the death of President von Hindenburg in 1934, Hitler declared himself Führer of Germany, absolute dictator. Hitler believed the world to come would be dominated by 4 main superpowers. Germany was to be the main hegemonic power of mainland Europe, the British maintaining their international empire. The Japanese, or the Aryans of the East as Hitler liked to call them, would be the main power in Southeast Asia and the Pacific, and finally America would dominate the Western Hemisphere. Part of Nazi support was their opposition to the Treaty of Versailles, and upon coming to power, Hitler promised to return Germany to its rightful place in the world. Hitler's objectives were clear. The economy needed to be self-sufficient, and what the Germans called economic autarky, being able to produce their own goods and not relying too heavily on imports. This was critical to withstand a British blockade to trade, a policy that had damaged Germany in the First World War. Germany would also need Lebensraum, or living space, that would facilitate the growing German population. Lebensraum was to be found in the east, and this meant Germany would have to expand into Poland, Czechoslovakia, Ukraine, and agricultural regions of the Soviet Union. For Hitler, this new German Reich that was to be created was to be racially pure, containing only the Aryan race, free of Slavs and Jews of whom would have to leave or be eliminated. And it was also Germany's mission to launch a crusade against Judeo-Bolshevism, an ideology and enemy that's home took the form of the Soviet Union. A war he thought would inevitably have to happen. The international system that had been envisaged was not able to cope. Without the support of the British and the United States' absence following a policy of non-interventionism, France was left alone to maintain and enforce the Treaty of Versailles, something it couldn't and didn't want to do alone. Held in Geneva, Switzerland, the disarmament conference provided a preview for how Hitler operated and what future Nazi policy would look like. Hitler instructed his representatives at the conference to state that Germany would completely disarm, if, and only if, France, Britain, Japan and the United States would do the same. This was an offer that Hitler correctly assumed would be denied, and so he went back to the German people and showed them how this conference was not about disarmament, but rather keeping Germany subjugated. And so in 1933, Hitler withdrew from the League of Nations and the Disarmament Conference to the support of his people. In 1934, to the surprise of the international community, Germany signed a non-aggression pact with Poland, taking an ally away from France and weakening France's military positioning, as Germany was now free to the east. In March of 1935, Germany revealed it had been building an air force, the Luftwaffe, again breaking the Treaty of Versailles, with the justification being that Britain, France and Poland all had an air force and that Germany too needed to defend itself. 1 week later, Hitler declared his intentions to introduce conscription, to build an army of 500,000 men. Once again, the League of Nations protested, but no action was taken. The disarmament clauses outlined in the Treaty of Versailles had been destroyed. Then, in June of 1935, to France's horror, Britain had entered into a naval agreement with Germany. The Anglo-German Naval Agreement, in which Britain recognised Germany's right to build up its navy. They were to be allowed up to 35% of Britain's surface tonnage and a submarine fleet up to 60% that of Britain's. Britain had struck a deal, and in doing so had given up on Versailles, given up on disarmament, and began to show Hitler that a policy of appeasement was to be pursued. A year later, in March 1936, German troops were sent into the demilitarised Rhineland. The matter was referred to the League of Nations, which once again did nothing. Remilitarisation of the Rhine was the final nail in the coffin for the Treaty of Versailles and the international order. The treaty was now officially dead. France, in response to German occupation of the Rhine, constructed a Maginot Line along its eastern border. However, the fortification stopped at the Ardennes forest and did not extend across the Belgian frontier, the place at which Germany had entered during the Great War. The French were preparing for a war of the trenches and were not prepared for the motorised divisions that made German blitzkrieg tactics so effective. Stalin at this time, threatened by German power and aggression, entered the Soviet Union into the League of Nations, and also signed an agreement with Czechoslovakia, stating he would come to their aid if attacked, but only if the Western Allies would come to its defence first. This was to stop the West trying to push German aggression eastwards. Hitler wanted all German-speaking nations in Europe to be unified, especially his native homeland Austria. Under the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, Germany and Austria were forbidden to be unified, as the Allies hadn't fought 4 years to see a larger Germany. Austrian President Schuschnigg, knowing he would receive no help from Italy and that France and Britain would not interfere in Hitler's plans, resigned, and 2 days later, German troops marched into Austria unopposed. Hitler had successfully annexed Austria, under the guise of national self-determination as justification. After the successful reoccupation of the Rhineland and the annexation of Austria, Hitler turned to Czechoslovakia, of which 3 million people in the Sudetenland were of German origin. The Czech government hoped that Britain and France would come to its assistance in the event of a German invasion, but British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain was intent on avoiding war. He made 2 trips to Germany in September and offered Hitler favourable agreements, but the Führer kept increasing his demands. On the 30th of September 1938, Hitler attended a meeting in Munich, accompanied by Britain, France and Italy, all of whom agreed that Hitler should have the Sudetenland, as long as he promised to go no further. The Soviets and the Czechs were not represented at the meeting, and realising that no country would come to their aid, Czechoslovakia were forced to surrender the Sudetenland to Germany. After the meeting, Chamberlain went to Hitler and asked him to sign a peace treaty between Great Britain and Germany, to which Hitler happily agreed. Upon his return to Britain, Chamberlain delivered his Peace in Our Time speech to cheering crowds. To people at the time, Neville Chamberlain was a great champion. The Munich Agreement had won the peace and war was averted. But from this, Hitler saw Europe as weak and unwilling to stand up to his demands. Winston Churchill, one of Chamberlain's greatest critics, said, "You were given the choice between war and dishonour. You chose dishonour and you will have war." Churchill was proven right when just half a year later, on the 15th of March 1939, German troops marched into Czechoslovakia. Once again, Hitler had broken an agreement. France and Britain then guaranteed Poland's safety, with Britain also beginning to rearm and install a highly secret radar system along its east coast. On August 23, 1939, the Germans and the Soviets signed a non-aggression pact, which sent shockwaves across the world's diplomatic community. The signing of this pact for Hitler ended the prospect of a two-front war, which allowed for a greater taking of Poland, but for Stalin this bought him time, to rebuild the Red Army that he had purged. As the last days of summer arrived, there was a sense in Europe that war was imminent, and the sense was right. Blitzkrieg, or lightning war, revolutionized warfare, and allowed an attacker to destroy an opponent before they were even mobilized. Through the use of tanks or panzers, German forces were able to quickly smash border defences and circle enemy troops. They were to be supported by tactical air power, the Luftwaffe, that provided close aerial support to ground operations. Using this tactic, Germany was able to quickly knock out opponents, allowing them to conduct operations without the total mobilization of the economy and society, much like the First World War had required. The First World War was one of attrition, something Germany wasn't in the current position to win or endure. This new mode of warfare, therefore, was to be one of speed and efficiency. On September 1st, 1939, Germany, with 52 divisions and over 1 million men, made their way into Poland, attacking through the north and the south, destroying the Polish armed forces. Britain responded with an ultimatum to Germany to cease military operations. The ultimatum was ignored, and so France, Britain, Australia and New Zealand all declared war on Germany, with Neville Chamberlain broadcasting the announcement on radio. The German attack was led by 5 armoured divisions, containing 300 tanks apiece, followed by 4 motorised infantry divisions, carrying their artillery and equipment, with cover provided from the air by the Luftwaffe. Believing that the invasion would be stopped by British and French intervention, the Polish were slow to mobilise and poorly prepared to face the German onslaught. Upon mobilisation, the Poles sported 1.3 million men, however possessed outdated equipment and only a few tanks, with the German armoured and motorised divisions outnumbering the Polish 15-1. Equipment was so scarce and outdated for the Polish that cavalry squadrons were seen to be charging heavily armoured German tank divisions. The invasion had worked with greater speed and efficiency than planned, and by September 8th, Warsaw, the Polish capital, had been reached. Once Germany had broken Polish resistance, Stalin moved troops into Poland, being keen to regain territory that had once belonged to Russia before the 1917 revolution. Poland was now to fight a war on 2 fronts, something it couldn't win, and so on the 27th of September 1939, Polish commanders negotiated a ceasefire, with the last Polish military unit surrendering on October 6th. Altogether, Poland lost 70,000 troops against the German invaders, and another 50,000 against the USSR, with 133,000 being wounded. The Germans took over 700,000 Polish prisoners, and the Soviets another 300,000. 150,000 Poles managed to escape, many coming to Great Britain and enlisting in the armed forces. For Hitler, the invasion of Poland was his 3rd successful annexation of a foreign country. He had got what he wanted, and the Western powers had once again done nothing. This period became known as the Phony War, because Britain and France took no military action despite declaring war on Germany. Blitzkrieg had been a major success, and over the course of the next few months, Hitler continuously said that he didn't want a war in the West. Three months after the invasion of Poland, Stalin was afraid that Finland would fall under German influence, as Leningrad was only 20 miles away from the Finnish border. The Soviets demanded the Finns cede territory on the Karelian Isthmus, as to put Leningrad out of danger. The Finns refused, and so the Soviet Union launched military action on the 30th of November 1939. The Soviet army outnumbered the Finns 50-1, and in equipment outmatched them in almost every way. But the Finns fought with great tenacity, wearing white uniforms as to blend into the snow and outmaneuvering the Red Army. Finland resisted Soviet attacks for more than 2 months and inflicted considerable damage. After the Soviet military reorganized itself and adopted different tactics, they continued their offensive in February, overcoming Finnish defences. The war came to an end in March 1940 with the signing of the Moscow Peace Treaty, with Finland surrendering 11% of its territory to the Soviet Union. The dreadful performance of the Red Army in Finland encouraged Hitler to think that an attack on the Soviet Union would be successful, and confirmed to the Western powers that the Soviet military was not the best equipped or organised, something that wouldn't be fully tested for another 15 months with the German launch of Operation Barbarossa. In April of 1940, Adolf Hitler made a huge strategic gamble. His plan was to send the whole strength of the German navy along the Norwegian coast, from Oslo to Narvik, to protect the coastal waterways. Swedish iron ore could then be safely transported to German blast furnaces, and German control of Norwegian waters would make an Allied blockade of Germany a lot harder. British discontent over the Norwegian campaign and an Allied withdrawal led to the resignation of Neville Chamberlain on the 10th of May 1940. His successor was appointed the same day, a man who throughout the 1930s had spoken out regarding German rearmament and Hitler's threat to the world, a man who went by the name of Winston Churchill. They were to push through the Ardennes forest, a naturally fortified area, something the French were not expecting to be entered or breached. 41,000 vehicles successfully made their way through the Ardennes forest. The Germans then crossed the Meuse River and by May 15th capture Sedan. They then head west, cutting off and surrounding the entire Allied army that had advanced into Belgium. This unexpected push through the Ardennes would force Allied soldiers out of Belgium, with them having to withdraw to the port of Dunkirk to protect their flank. With the Allies completely surrounded by German forces, Winston Churchill launches a plan to evacuate the British Expeditionary Force from northern France. 400,000 Allied troops are stranded on the beaches of Dunkirk, and on May 26, Operation Dynamo begins. By air, the Luftwaffe constantly attack the soldiers stranded on the beaches and sink many ships, and by land, German artillery fires upon the shore. The Royal Air Force in response launches a counter-attack to protect the ships and soldiers. The beaches at Dunkirk were shallow, and even at a high tide, destroyers couldn't approach within a mile of the shore, and so the troops would have to be ferried out in small craft. On the 31st of May, hundreds of civilian vessels known as little ships make their way across the English Channel to evacuate the soldiers. Fishing boats, lifeboats, sailing barges, ferries and supply ships all do their part in bringing the soldiers home. The British Expeditionary Force had survived, but almost all of the heavy artillery and equipment was left behind. By the 4th of June 1940, 338,000 troops had been evacuated, making the events at Dunkirk a miracle and the largest evacuation in military history. The surrender of France followed some 3 weeks later, after Mussolini declared war on France and German troops marched into Paris, sealing France's fate. In just 6 weeks, from the 10th of May 1940, German forces conquered France, Belgium, Luxembourg and the Netherlands. By the end of June, Hitler dominated the European continent, with victory on a scale never seen before. What Germany hadn't accomplished in 4 years in the Great War had taken Hitler just 35 days, which has later become known as one of the most remarkable military campaigns in history. The future of the free world hung in the balance. Britain faced a perilous situation after the fall of France, and all that separated the Germans from yet another victory was the English Channel. The isolationist United States was an ocean away, which left only one man to make a decision that would change the course of human history. With the fighting over, Germany began to consider ways of resolving the question of how to deal with Britain. Hitler hoped that Churchill would come to his senses and sign a peace treaty, but if the British refused, Hitler's only option was to invade. Churchill then delivered his "We will fight on the beaches" speech. This famous speech transformed Churchill into a world statesman, outlining unequivocally he would never make peace with Hitler, but war was now to come. Germany had to plan an invasion of Great Britain. The invasion of France and Poland had taken months to plan, with every intricate detail of battle thought through, but the invasion of Britain, with orders from High Command, would have to be ready by August 15th, giving them just 1 month. The British began to dig in. Coastal defences were constructed across southern England, signposts were removed and replaced to confuse invaders, fields were laced with barbed wire to deter airborne troops, and a home guard was established full of those who were illegible or too old to fight. Meanwhile, Hitler began his plan for the invasion of the British Isles, codenamed Operation Sea Lion. 20 divisions were to be deployed on Britain's south coast through the use of amphibious landing craft. However, the English Channel wasn't easy to cross. The Royal Navy was still the largest in the world, and despite empire commitments, Britain's home fleet of ships still far outnumbered the German Navy. The German naval chief, Admiral Erich Raeder, didn't believe he could seize the English Channel for long enough to get the German army across. For a successful invasion of Britain, therefore, Germany would first have to gain control of the sky. The Luftwaffe far outnumbered the Royal Air Force. In June of 1940, the British had less than 700 operational fighters, against 2,600 German fighters and bombers. The odds were daunting. Both sides sported some of the most advanced planes of the time. The British with their Supermarine Spitfire and the Hawker Hurricane, which shot down the most German planes. These were up against the German Messerschmitt Bf 109, and these were to be used to escort German bombers. The use of radar was crucial to the British during the Battle of Britain, and was the world's first integrated air defence system. Placed along the south and east coasts of Britain, these tall masts could pick up aircraft at a range of 120 miles, giving their distance, direction, height and numbers. This information would then be sent to RAF Fighter Command, run by Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, and the closest RAF airfields would then be alerted. On the 10th of July 1940, the Luftwaffe began to attack shipping travelling across the English Channel, but this was not their main aim. General Goering, head of the German Air Force, focused the German assault on destroying the RAF in the sky, their airfields, and aircraft production factories. When the initial assault was launched, airfields were heavily bombed, but none had been put out of action. British radar gave them plenty of warning and were able to shoot down the enemy planes in long-lasting dogfights that would consume the sky. The Luftwaffe had lost 46 aircraft to just 12 British. 2 days later, Goering launched the largest attack of the whole battle. On August 15th, waves of German bombers destroyed British airfields. 42 British fighters had been destroyed, at the cost of 90 German aircraft. Over the next 12 days, Goering's plan continued, and fighters on both sides were suffering. The Royal Air Force were exhausted, and the German fighters were demoralised as the British seemed to always be waiting for them. But British losses soon began to rapidly increase. Many men died, and planes and airfields were being destroyed at an alarming rate. If the battle continued along these lines, a German victory would be imminent. Goering, realising this, began to attack at night as well. However, a major mistake was about to occur. On the cloudy night of August 24th, a group of German bombers lost their way and accidentally bombed the city of London. The following night, 81 British bombers made their way to Berlin in retaliation, an act that showed Britain could attack as well as defend. Hitler was furious and began a campaign of bombing London. On the 7th of September, German bombers attacked London's East End. 450 people died and thousands of homes were destroyed. But this was a crucial mistake. By focusing on London rather than the airfields, RAF bases were relieved of pressure and had the time to repair and rebuild their aircraft. 1 week later, on the 15th of September, on what became known as the Battle of Britain Day, the Luftwaffe embarked on an all-out attack against London, which they believed would break Fighter Command's resistance and pave the way for its successful invasion. The RAF successfully fought the incoming wave of Luftwaffe formations, destroying 61 aircraft, the highest losses the Luftwaffe had suffered for over a month, with the RAF only losing 31 aircraft. The 15th of September can be seen as an overwhelming and decisive defeat for the Luftwaffe. They had failed to gain air superiority over Great Britain, and on September 17th, just 2 days later, Hitler postponed Operation Sea Lion. With the help of foreign pilots, especially those of Poland, France and Czechoslovakia, the Royal Air Force were able to repel a Nazi invasion. To show his appreciation to all those who fought, Churchill said the following:
"Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few."
With the invasion of Britain no longer possible, Hitler turned his attention eastwards. Germany was now to focus on the largest military operation in human history, Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. The fighting was not over, however. The Blitz had now begun. British cities were bombed in night raids, and London was attacked every night for 57 consecutive nights bar one. And on November 10th, 1940, a 14th century Gothic cathedral in Coventry was obliterated. Children were evacuated to the countryside, and people living in London spent most nights sleeping in air raid shelters or in the London Underground. A blackout was enforced after darkness, where all sources of light had to be covered up, as to prevent the Germans from seeing where towns and homes were located. Over the course of the Blitz, which lasted 8 months and 5 days, just under 2 million homes were destroyed, and 40,000 civilians were killed, with 87,000 being seriously injured. But most importantly, the bombing had failed to demoralise the British into surrender. The full force of the German war machine was now to be turned against the Soviet Union. This war was to be won to the death, a clash of two ideologies, two forces of civilization in which only one could be victorious. Hitler hated communism, and victory over the Soviet Union would provide Germany with the abundant natural resources that would enable the German people to finally become the master race. Operation Barbarossa was Hitler's greatest gamble. Unable to defeat Great Britain in the west, Germany's armies were deployed to the east. Luckily for Hitler, the Red Army, the largest in the world, had been devastated by Stalin's purges during the 1930s. Tens of thousands of officers were shot or imprisoned, and inefficiency and a lack of coordination became widespread. Before the invasion began, and to secure Germany's southern flank, on April 6, 1941, Germany invaded the Balkans. 33 divisions entered Yugoslavia, and 6 days later they surrendered. Greece then fell, and Athens was captured within 3 weeks. Operation Barbarossa could now commence. Over 4 million men were to be deployed, accompanied by over 3,000 aircraft. 3 divisions were also to be used, much like the invasion of France. Army Group North would push through the Baltic states and seize Leningrad. Army Group Center was to advance to Moscow, and Army Group South would occupy the Ukraine. The Red Army was far larger. They had 2 million men along the Western Front and millions more in reserve. They also sported 20,000 tanks against Germany's 6,000, although they were older and less advanced. Germany versus the Soviet Union would therefore be a war between superior technology and speed versus sheer numbers. On June 22, 1941, the operation began at 3:15 a.m. The Luftwaffe attacked Soviet airfields while the ground invasion commenced. Hitler's panzers then pushed forward and within 2 days had penetrated more than 50 miles. The Red Army was no match, and tens of thousands of Soviet prisoners were rounded up. As July came, Blitzkrieg was successful as ever. Within a week, the panzers were at Smolensk, only a few hundred miles away from Moscow. It was here that the tanks would rest, so the rest of the army that often relied on horse-drawn carriages could catch up. Prisoners that had been captured along the way also began heading west to captivity, in which 2.5 million men would never return. Meanwhile, the German advance in the south was having troubles, and so Hitler ordered Army Group North to swing south to Kiev to provide help, to which his generals heavily objected. It would turn out to be a disastrous decision. Soviet manpower seemed to be endless, and the halt at Smolensk allowed Stalin to mobilize more than 16 million troops, and a new Soviet tank was headed towards the front line, the T-34, which was faster than the Panzer Mark IV. The remnants of Army Group North surrounded Leningrad, modern-day St. Petersburg, but rather than capturing the city, the Germans decided to starve it. Starvation began, and more than 11,000 people died in November, and another 3,700 on one day in December alone. The siege lasted for more than 2 years, and by the end in 1944, over 1 million Soviets had been killed. Army Group Center now prepared for an offensive on Moscow, and on the 20th of September 1941 they began their assault. The panzers advanced, and even more Soviet troops were captured. But Stalin was determined to defend Moscow to the last. On October 8th, bad weather halted the German advance, and they were still 50 miles from Moscow. Hitler would now pay the price for sending troops south rather than advancing on Moscow earlier on in the year. Speed that gave German blitzkrieg tactics the advantage was now obsolete. The Soviet winter arrived. German forces, thinking the campaign would be over by summer, were underprepared. Tank engines would not start, weapons froze, and soldiers were frostbitten as they didn't have the proper clothing. And on December 5th, Germany halted its attack. Stalin then moved his armies from Siberia to the west. More than 30 divisions made their way, who were all well equipped and trained for fighting in the winter. By December, more than 500,000 extra men were in place. With additional support, the Soviets began a counterattack, driving German forces back. For the next 7 days, Soviet troops tore into German forces. Hitler ordered for there to be no more retreats. He told his forces they should fight, and if necessary, die where they stood. The German line held strong. For the next 4 months, the two sides fought, and Hitler hadn't got the quick results that he had wanted or planned. Hitler's army then moved south in search for oil, and began a campaign of securing Stalingrad. And so began one of the longest battles of the Second World War. The city had to be taken street by street, house by house, and room by room. But the Soviets too began to move troops and equipment southwards. More than 1 million men, 900 tanks, and more than 1,000 aircraft were moved to the battle zone and attacked the German flank. It was now the Germans who surrendered in their thousands. Over 100,000 men made their way to captivity, with only 5,000 eventually returning to Germany. Germany lost 300,000 men in the Battle of Stalingrad, and the Soviets around the same numbers. But the tide of the battle had begun to turn. The Soviet army continued its success. German troops began to withdraw to protect their flank, and the Soviet winter offensive saw them gain lots of territory. Over the course of a few months, Germany had lost over 1 million men. The Soviet army mobilized further and drove back the German lines at Kursk. Never again would the German war machine launch an offensive in the east. Across the globe, on the 26th of November 1941, a Japanese carrier fleet set sail in the northern Pacific. Its target was a US naval base in Hawaii, which went by the name of Pearl Harbor. What had been confined to a mainly European war was now to be transformed into the deadliest global conflict in human history.